Amen. I'll be coming today from Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 through 3. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. You don't have to stand. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. If I could talk for a second from text, quitters never win. Quitters never win. In the 1950s and 60s political and cultural landscape, it was a time of turmoil. Blacks and other minorities walked the blood-drenched sidewalks hoping and praying that their humanity would soon be realized. They dreamt of a day where they could stare their white counterparts in the face without being dragged through Barnum and Bailey courtrooms. They dreamt of days when they would be taken seriously, intellectually, and politically. They longed for better, and they fought for it. But while they were fighting, there were some that thought of surrendering, being hit on every side by fire hoses and church bombings, jail time, public beatings, police brutality, colored-only signs, housing restrictions, job loss, government surveillance. People were confronted with the choice to throw in the towel and quit. Persecution was commonplace, and while history tells of the triumph of the minority, there are untold stories of throwing in the towel. The man who was scared into selling his business or have it burned down. The family who was forced out of the white neighborhood by burning crosses and white clothes, cowards. And close to our hearts, the Dallas black preachers who kept the prophet Martin Luther King Jr. from entering the city. All of these threw in the towel. They fell to the fear of change and freedom. They aborted their role in the deliverance of a people because they were content in second-class citizenship. They thought that it brought supposedly less problems than standing up for their rights. And truth be told, this is not a new phenomenon. The recipients of the sermon entitled Hebrews dealt with this same struggle. They are a group of Christian people who are struggling with persecution. Their stuff has been taken away from them. They have no say in government. They are the second-class citizens trying to find their place in a society who does not want them anymore. They are struggling to understand what they are called to do. They wish for days when their brothers and their sisters would see them as people. They want to go back to the good old days of law and yearly sacrifice. They are confused and want stability in their life. They no longer want to struggle for the cause of Christ. They are tired of fighting, tired of enduring, tired of dying, tired of being ostracized, tired of being misunderstood. They're just tired. And who could blame them? Who could blame them for wanting a normal life again? Who could blame them for wanting to walk back into the synagogues and the temples for a chance at normality? Who could blame them for wanting to quit? And when we look at our lives and our culture, we are no different. We still don't handle hard times well. Children are being bullied in school to the point of suicide or mass retaliation. Parents are taking theirs and their children's lives because of hard times. The church is no longer growing in the West with leaps and bounds. And it seems like it's a time to quit. As we come closer to home, we notice that statistics show that blacks are among the more likely to drop out or transfer from school. Our GPA is among the lowest of all ethnic groups. We sit in our classroom discouraged at the lack of black presence, and we still deal with the underhanded racial prejudice, and many of us feel like it's time to quit and throw in the towel. I can't take it anymore. Just like the recipients of Hebrews, we want to go back to what is comfortable, forgetting the faith and the promise that was given to us. We forget the forgers of our faith. We forget the sufficient sacrifice of Christ. We forget the rest we find in God. We forget the better things ahead. We forget that we have a faultless new covenant. We forget the Abrahams, Isaacs, and Jacobs. We forget the Enochs, Abels, and Noahs. We forget the Sarahs, Rahabs, and Marys. We forget those who have done mighty acts. The women who received the resurrection of their families. We forget those tortured and killed for the cause. We forget the mockings and scourgings and chains chains and prisons and stonings and water hoses and marches and protests and assassinations. We have forgotten that faith is heaven hoped for even when it's hell on earth. We long for the dark corners of hell because even the peephole from which we glimpse heaven has too much struggled with it for us to approach it. And so we quit. My brothers and my sisters, we must realize the old saying that winners never quit and quitters never win. So you may be asking the question, in times like these when I'm tempted to quit because it takes too much hurt, I'm in too much pain, I'm too lonely, I'm impoverished, and I'm too hated. In times like these, how do I hold on to my faith, understanding that quitters never win and winners never quit? You have to understand that first you have to remember you are an athlete. Verse 1 says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. You have to understand that you are athletes, surrounded by witnesses. The text says that these witnesses are both spectators and they're relay runners. They both cheer you on in the crowd, encouraging you as you run your race, and yet they have already done the work that they were supposed to do, and they're handing to you your baton to run your race. You are an athlete in a race of spectators and relay runners. Before you can run, you have to understand that you have to take off the dead weight. The text says, let us lay aside every weight. It says in Paul, he's talking about this illustration of his day. The athletes would come into the stadium, and when they were about to run, they would strip down naked because they understood that when they were running, they could not have any clothes on because it acted as a barrier for them. Every time they would take a step, their clothing would trip them up. And so Paul is telling them, you got to take off some stuff. You got to take off some weights in your life. You got to take off some things in your life that keep you from running effectively. He names these as weights and sins. Weights are those things that aren't necessarily bad for you, but they get in the way. It could be that man or woman that you have, not necessarily bad for you, but gets in the way of you serving the Lord. Might be that job that you just got. It's not necessarily bad for you, but it gets in the way for you to do the will of God. Maybe it's your parents. They're not necessarily bad for you, but they get in the way of doing the will of God. You've got to lay them aside sometimes, but not just weights. He says sins, those things that we do that keep us from God. It's the orientation away from following Christ. You have to understand that if you are going to run this race effectively, you've got to let it go. But then you have to also understand that you're an athlete that runs with endurance. This is not a short race. This is a long race. This is not a 100-meter-yard dash. It's a 5K. You have to understand that life does not happen quickly. Struggles are not over quickly. Maturity doesn't come in a day. You have to understand that your life takes a lifetime to mature. That you take a lifetime to get to where God wants you to be. Here's the problem, that our culture wants everything right now. Whenever we want to know some information, we can Google it. Whenever we want to buy something, we can go to a website and buy it instantly. Whenever we want to know news, we go right to the news station. We want to talk to somebody. We no longer write letters and wait weeks at a time to try and get it back. No, we can call them, we can text them, we can Facebook them, we can tweet. We have to understand that our culture tells us that everything needs to happen right now. But this is not the race that we're in. The text says the race is not given to the swift nor to the strong. You have to understand that when you're running for Christ, you are in a long race for the prize. Let me see if I can help somebody out. There's a childhood story. Some of you grew up in the times where Looney Tunes was on TV. You remember they told the story about the tortoise and the hare? Y'all remember that story? The rabbit goes to the turtle and says, hey, man, I think I can beat you in a race. The turtle, he's so humble. He don't want no trouble. He said, okay, man. He said, well, let's get the fox. The fox can help us out. The fox goes and he picks the track. Then he goes and officiates. So then the fox says, on your mark, get set, go. The rabbit takes off running. The rabbit's running so fast, he knows he's faster than the turtle. The turtle's behind him saying, slow and steady wins the race. The rabbit is running. He understands that he's going to win this race. He got the stamina. He knows he's faster. He knows the track. He knows he can run faster. But all the while, the turtle is back there step by step saying, slow and steady wins the race. Well, the rabbit looks at this big tree. It's about as big as this pole right here. He's looking at this tree. Can you just imagine that tree with big branches, big shade under it, and it's cool under there. It's 100 degrees outside, but under the shade, it's about 80 degrees. He just wants to take a little nap. So he says, I'm far ahead. I can go ahead and take a nap. So he goes over there. He sits under that tree. He says, the turtle is way far behind me. All of a sudden, he drifts off into this sleep. All this time, the turtle is taking step by step, saying, slow and steady wins the race. He's still stepping slow and steady, wins the race. He gets to the rabbit. He sees him under that tree. He says, man, I'm tired, but I want to win this race. Let me go ahead and keep on stepping, step by step, slow and steady wins the race. He passes that rabbit. All of a sudden, the rabbit wakes up, looks at his clock. It's been 2 hours he's been sleeping. All he wanted to do was take a 10-minute nap. So he gets up, begins to run. He knows that he can still beat this turtle. He says, the turtle's so slow, I can take 2 hours off and still beat him. So then when he gets to the finish line, he watches the turtle cross the finish line before he does. And then guess what the turtle does? He goes right under that tree and he takes a nap. And here's what some people need to understand. They're running their life like the rabbit. They think they can get somewhere quickly. They think just because they're running it fast, bypassing all problems, bypassing all woes, bypassing all hard times, that you're going to get the prize before the turtle. But oh, if you could be like that turtle who says slow and steady wins the race. I got some learning to do in this life. Slow and steady wins the race. I got some trials to go through. Slow and steady wins the race. Not only will you get the prize, but you get the rest. And so you have to understand that winners never quit and quitters never win. So not only must you remember that you are an athlete, but you must remember your salvation. You look in the text, verse 2 says it like this: looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Remember your salvation. We look to everyone to solve our problems. We look to counselors to tell us what's wrong with us. We look to parents to tell us who they want us to be. And we look to friends who don't know nothing about nothing to tell us that we're correct about who we are. Not only do we look to them, we look to Pookie and them and little Ray Ray to tell us what we ought to be doing right. But we need to be looking to Jesus. Psalm 121 says, I will lift up mine eyes to the hills, from which cometh my help. My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. If we understand that Jesus the Christ made heaven and earth, has all power, why is it that we're looking to everyone else who don't know how many hairs are on our head, who don't know when we ought to die, who don't know when we came into being, who don't know anything about us? Why do we look to these people to solve our problems? Instead, we need to be looking to the author and the finisher, because you do know that he not only designed our faith, but he reminds us how it should look. He not only showed us how it should look, but he lived out the faith. Let me give you an example. Sweet Home is in the middle of a building process. In the building process, there's an architect. The architect draws up the blueprints. Some people can't read the blueprints. Some people don't know what the blueprint stands for. They see lines and dashes and numbers and angles, and they don't know anything that's going on. Some people are in there just doing carpentry. Some people are just there to paint. Some are there to just wire everything. Some are up there to make sure that the walls are strong. But there are only a couple of people who can read that blueprint. And when you got a problem about what's going on with the building, when you want to know where it should be on the campus, when you want to know how it should look, how big it ought to be, you got to go to someone who can read the blueprint. And you got to understand that Jesus is that architect. He's the one that designed it. He's the one that knows what it should look like. He's the one that can tell you what it needs to be. So you got to understand that when you're talking about your problems and your struggles, suffering on the cross. The author and perfecter tells us exactly where our faith should be, and that's suffering unto death. We have to understand that Christ is our example. He obeyed the Father. He went and healed folk. He went and preached. He went and called disciples, and this was done in hard times. The government was after him. The religious leaders were after him. Every once in a while, they try and stone him. They picked him up and beat him down. They killed him. You have to understand that whatever pain and suffering you're going through, Jesus is the one that is the example for you. He's not only Christ as example, but he's Christus Victor. That means that he conquered every situation in your life. All the hard times you have, all the struggles that you have, all the money loss that you have. You looking for a job, God conquered that for you. With Jesus Christ on the cross. But also not just that, Christ is a debt payer. You got to understand that not only did he conquer all those problems, but he conquered your sin. You think you're not good enough to step before God, and you know what? You're right. But if it had not been for Jesus who was on your side, where would you be? If it had not been for Christ who died on that cross, you would not be able to stand before God. But you got to understand, he didn't do this because he was bored. He had plenty of things to do. You're running the universe. He didn't do this because he just thought it was a good idea. The text says that he did it for the joy of the glory. He did it for salvation's purposes. The reason why you can remember your salvation is because Christ was intent on saving you. Make no mistake, it was not by chance that you did this. It was because Christ took the time out to die on a cross for whoever would come and believe in him. Your salvation was thought about. But not just that. Jesus' act of salvation was final. The text said that he sat down at the right hand of the Father. Let me go back. Israelites. Every year they would have to do a Day of Atonement. The high priest would go into the temple, would sprinkle blood everywhere, scared out of his mind, thinking that maybe he won't make it out of the temple. After a while, he would do all he has to do, he'd speak into this goat, send it off on its way, and then he'd come out. And the people are looking at the high priest, and they're sweating, and they're wondering, is it final? Did it go through? Did God accept it? And the high priest, he'd look at them, and he'd take his seat, letting them know that it's final. And when you look at Christ, who came into the temple called the body, he goes and he sacrifices himself. And people are waiting. His disciples are scared. They're wondering if it is final. And then you see Christ go up to heaven. And the scriptures say that he sat down at the right hand of the Father. Here's what I'm saying to you. You can remember your salvation because not only did he perform your salvation, but it's final. Nothing else has to be done. You don't have to go through anybody else. You don't have to talk to anybody else. All you got to know is that you believe in Jesus Christ. It's final. Your salvation is final. But here's the thing. What would have happened if Jesus never did get up? What would have happened if he never did go into the garden and say, not my will, your will? What would have happened if he got upset and called his legion of angels down to take out everybody who was messing with him? Here's what happens. You would not have a salvation. I would not have a salvation. I would not have a home to go to when I'm gone except to hell. You have to understand you can remember your salvation because Christ did, in fact, get up. He didn't quit. He didn't throw in the towel. And so you have to understand that winners never quit and quitters never win. Not only must you remember you are an athlete, and not only must you remember your salvation, but you got to remember Christ as your example. Look at the text. It says, consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Remember Christ as your example. It says to consider Christ your example. Anytime you go through hard times, first thing you ought to do is consider Christ, who endured what you endured. time you go through some hard times in your life, some struggles, some pain, some heartaches, remember Christ. Consider means to think about. That means to have Christ on your mind. Ray Charles said Georgia on my mind, but you ought to have Christ on your mind. Y'all know that song. He says, think about Christ. It's a banking term. It means to deposit. Let me see. Many of us, we got a check. We get a check. And many of us, if not all of us, have a banking account. We take our check to the bank, and we say, I want to deposit my money in the bank. But look at this. We don't just deposit the money in the bank just to sit there. We need that money to pay bills, to drive around every day, to eat every day. We put the money in the bank so that we can retrieve it later. And this is what the text is saying to us. That Jesus ought to be in your memory bank so that when hard times come on you, you can retrieve something about Christ. Let me say it another way. When I think about the goodness of the Lord and all that He's done, my soul says, yeah. When I think about all the victories I've won, my soul says, yeah. When I'm weak, it says, my grace is sufficient. Yeah, you got to understand that when Christ is in your mind, you can get through whatever situation that you are in. And so you have to understand that you ought to consider Christ because He endured the worst pain than you and I ever will. How many of us were on a cross? How many of us were beat into inches of our life? How many of us endured sin like Christ did? None of us did. And here's what we have to understand. Because Christ endured far more than we ever will, Christ is the only one we can take our problems to. Because Christ was the one that put everything on His back. Not just your sin, but your hard times. Not just your hard times, but your depression. It is Christ that you can go to. Just think about Christ so that you don't fall away. Have Christ on your mind so that you don't backslide. Here's the problem. You fall because you forget about Christ. You want to give up because you gave up Christ a long time ago. You left Christ in that one-room apartment when you got your 5-room bed. You left Christ in that $21 bank account when you got $100,000 in the bank now. Someone's not hearing me. You left Christ at that job at McDonald's when now you work in corporate. Someone don't want to talk. You left Christ somewhere, and now you need to go and retrieve Christ. The reason why you step off the track is because you've left your baton. Christ. I'll go on. Winners never quit. Quitters never win. In 1992, at the Olympics in Barcelona, there was a man who decided this would be his day. He decided that today I'm going to win the gold. This man was riddled with injuries all of his career. Every time it seemed like it looked like he was going to win, another injury would come about. He was discouraged, but now he said, I'm strong enough. I'm wise enough. I think I can make it this time. So on the 400-meter yard run, he gets in his blocks, and the man shoots the gun, and he begins to run. He's running, he's leading the pack, he's doing great. He thinks this will be the time that I will win gold. Everybody's rooting for him because they know the history of his craft. They know that he has been hurting for some time. And so he gets to the 200-meter yard mark, and all of a sudden, he pulls up. He pulls up because his hamstring has been pulled. Falls down smack dab on his face, and he begins to cry. He's seeing his hopes and his dreams leave him. He doesn't want to do it anymore. He knows that this would have been his last run. career is going to end in defeat. He hears the pitter-patter of the feet running by him, and he hears the hush in the crowd. They had such high hopes for him. He couldn't even make it. But then he begins to think. He says, I might not win the gold, but if I could just get to the finish line. If I could just finish the race just one time. He gets up, and Derek Redmond begins to limp. He has 200 meters to go, and he begins to limp. He's feeling the pain in his leg, and he's realizing that with that pain in his leg, 200 meters is a mighty long way to go. And so he begins to rethink whether he ought to continue on. They just want me off the track anyway. It's almost over anyway. People are around here trying to run their race, and I'm just in the way. Maybe I ought to step off the track. But as he's still limping, and he begins to hear the crowd cheer. He begins to hear the crowd holler. He begins to hear the crowd get excited. He's in too much pain to turn around to see what's going on. So he decides, maybe I'll just keep on limping. Maybe I'll just keep on moving. And then all of a sudden, somebody comes up under him and grips him by the side. And he puts his arm around that man. He looks over to him, and he sees that it's daddy. And then all of a sudden, you see him take one step, and his daddy take another step with him. His dad takes a step, and he limps on with him. And they do the last 200-meter yards with each other. Here's what I'm trying to say to you. That oftentimes we start the race off too quick. Oftentimes we think that we're going to win the gold, and then right at the 200-meter yard mark, we pull up in pain, struggles and hurt, hard times and shame. Folk don't want to be around me no more. Folk don't want to talk to me no more. I'm too hurt to keep on going. And then all of a sudden, we begin to hear the crowd yell. 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 We hear the crowd yell. And all of a sudden, somebody comes up behind us. Somebody comes up behind us, and we begin to limp. It's too painful. I can't make it. I can't get through it. But then somebody comes up behind us, and they help us along. Somebody comes up behind us and helps us along. Somebody comes up behind us and helps us along. And then all of a sudden, we get to the 200-meter yard. We get to the 400. We get to the end, and now we finally finish the race. Here's what I'm saying to you, though. But the father couldn't get to his son until the security guard let him through. The father couldn't get to the son until he let the security guard let him through. Here's what happened. You have Christ who goes down Golgotha's hill. He's placed on that cross. He dies for you and I. And then on Sunday, he rises again with all access, all power in his hand. And now when the father says, that's my child, he says, go on, go get your child. That's my son, go on, get your son. That's my daughter, go on, get your daughter. They're in need of help. Let me go get them. You have to understand that the reason why you can run on is because you're an athlete with endurance. The reason why you can run on is because you can remember Christ as your example. The reason why you can run on is because you got a sure salvation. Somebody